The emergency session of the Galactic Council was not going well. Then again, when you're discussing whether to obliterate an entire species before they become a problem, the bar for going well is pretty low to begin with. Commander Vexstar, a 7-foot-tall mantis-like creature with anger management issues and a Napoleon complex, slammed his 4 fists on the crystalline table. I'm telling you, these humans are dangerous. They've only been in space for 50 of their rotations, and they're already asking questions about our weapons systems. Ambassador Quillnox, who looked like a purple jellyfish, had a midlife crisis and decided to wear a diplomat's sash, quivered with what might have been indignation. Or maybe that was just how he breathed. Nobody really knew. Commander, you're being paranoid. They're primitive. They still use physical currency and argue about whose imaginary friend is better. Primitive? Vexstar's compound eyes practically bulged. They figured out faster than light travel using nothing but caffeine, stubbornness, and what they call percussive maintenance. Half their breakthrough technologies were invented by accident. They created artificial intelligence by trying to make a better search engine for cat videos. The other council members murmured among themselves. The Zephyrians made soft whistling sounds that translated roughly to "humans are weird." The Kronax delegation just sat there being crystalline and judgmental, which was basically their default state. Quillnox rippled dismissively. So they're lucky. That doesn't make them a threat. Lucky? Vexstar's voice cracked like a teenager asking someone to prom. They've been to war with themselves for their entire recorded history, and somehow still managed to develop philosophy, art, and something called extreme sports, where they voluntarily throw themselves off mountains for fun. These beings are either completely insane, or operating on a level of strategic thinking we can't comprehend. I vote insane, chirped Counselor Bleat, a small fuzzy creature who looked like a tribble with anxiety issues. That's exactly my point. Vexstar was getting that twitchy thing in his left antenna that meant he was about to suggest something spectacularly stupid. We need to test them. Send them our most feared predator. If they can handle the Shadow Maw, then we know they're too dangerous to exist. If they can't, well, problem solved. The council chamber fell silent except for the gentle humming of the life support systems and Bleat's nervous grooming sounds. You want to send the Shadow Maw to Earth? Quillnox's voice rose an octave. The creature that single-handedly depopulated the moon of Xerion? The beast that makes hardened space marines cry for their spawning pods? Exactly, Vexstar smiled, which was deeply unsettling when you had mandibles. One human settlement. If they survive and adapt, we'll know they're too dangerous to ignore. If they don't, we'll have our answer about their threat level. The vote was unanimous, mostly because everyone was too scared to argue with the mantis having a breakdown. The session ended. Quillnox floated over to Vexstar. You know this is probably going to backfire spectacularly, right? What's the worst that could happen? Vexstar asked, already beginning to program the Shadow Maw's deployment coordinates. Famous last words, as the humans might say. Dr. Morgan Wells was having the kind of evening that made her question her life choices. Not because anything was particularly wrong, mind you. It was just past 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. She was alone in the xenobiology lab eating her 3rd cup of instant ramen, and her biggest accomplishment of the day was successfully identifying a particularly stubborn alien fungus that had been giving her grief for 2 weeks. The fungus, it turned out, was just regular earth mold that had gotten into the sample container. Again. Note to self, she muttered, typing with one hand while slurping noodles with the other. Remind the interns that sterile conditions doesn't mean spray some Febreze around and hope for the best. The lab was quiet except for the hum of various machines keeping various alien specimens alive, frozen or in that weird in-between state that xenobiologists called, probably not dead but definitely not happy about it. Morgan had always preferred the night shift. Fewer people, fewer interruptions, and significantly fewer visits from her department head asking when she'd have something groundbreaking to justify her research budget. She was just reaching for her coffee mug when the air in the center of the lab began to shimmer. Not the good kind of shimmer like when you're slightly drunk and everything looks prettier. This was the kind of shimmer that meant either her equipment was malfunctioning or something was about to materialize in her workspace. Given her luck, probably both. The shimmer intensified, crackling with energy that made her hair stand up and her computer screen flicker. Then, with a sound like someone tearing a bedsheet made of thunder, reality decided to take a coffee break. What materialized in the middle of her lab was, by any reasonable definition, a nightmare. 8 feet tall, covered in midnight black scales that seemed to absorb light, with 6 limbs that ended in claws, designed by someone who clearly had strong opinions about dismemberment. Its head was elongated and predatory, with rows of teeth that belonged in a horror movie, and eyes that glowed with the kind of malevolent intelligence that suggested it had read Sun Tzu and taken note. This was the Shadow Maw, the terror of a dozen star systems, the creature that had entire civilizations checking under their beds before going to sleep, the apex predator that had never, in its entire evolutionary history, encountered anything that didn't immediately flee in terror. It looked around the lab with those glowing eyes, expecting to see the usual response to its presence: screaming, running, maybe some light fainting. What it got instead was Dr. Morgan Wells putting down her ramen and reaching for her observation tablet. "Well, that's new," she said, stylus poised over the screen. "Bipedal, no wait, hexapedal locomotion. Definitely carnivorous dentition. Some kind of bioluminescent ocular display." She looked up at the creature. "Are those scales, or is that some kind of chitinous plating? And how exactly did you get past security? Because I'm pretty sure the night guard is supposed to check IDs, even for interdimensional visitors." The Shadow Maw blinked. This was not going according to plan. In fact, this was so far from the plan that the plan was now just a tiny dot on the horizon of expectation. "I am the Shadow Maw," it rumbled in a voice like grinding stone. "Fear me." "Sure, buddy. Right after you fill out this visitor form." Morgan held up a clipboard. "Name, species, planet of origin, and purpose of visit. Also, do you have any allergies I should know about? Because I've got about 15 different atmospheric mixtures running in here, and I'd hate for you to break out in hives or something." The creature that had laid waste to the warrior poets of Andromeda Prime was being asked to fill out paperwork, and the human female was looking at it like it was a particularly interesting specimen that had wandered into the wrong terrarium. "I do not fill out forms," the Shadow Maw said, drawing itself up to its full terrifying height. "I am death incarnate. I am the end of worlds. I am—" "About 7.8 feet tall, I'd estimate," Morgan interrupted, making notes. "Fascinating bone structure. Is that natural armor or decorative scarification? And what's your diet like? Because those teeth suggest you're specialized for tearing, but the jaw structure implies you might be able to process plant matter too. Are you an opportunistic omnivore?" The Shadow Maw stared at her. In all its eons of existence, across all the worlds it had terrorized, no one had ever asked about its dietary preferences. It wasn't sure how to respond to scientific curiosity. Fear, yes. Worship, certainly. Desperate bargaining, absolutely. But genuine academic interest? This was uncharted territory. "I consume the flesh of my enemies," it said, somewhat uncertainly. And how's your fiber intake? Because I'm seeing some serious muscle mass here, and proper nutrition is important for maintaining that kind of physical condition." The most feared predator in the galaxy was getting nutritional advice from a human in a lab coat who was eating instant ramen at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. If the Galactic Council could see this, Vextar would probably molt from embarrassment. But the Shadow Maw was about to learn that its real challenge wasn't the human. It was what was about to come through the pet door. The pet door that Morgan had installed against 3 different safety regulations and 2 direct orders from her supervisor made a soft flapping sound. This was followed by the gentle patting of small paws on linoleum, and then the appearance of 12 pounds of orange tabby cat, who had absolutely no idea he was about to change the course of galactic history. Mr. Whiskers paused in the doorway, surveying his domain with the kind of casual arrogance that only cats and ancient Roman emperors could properly manage. His green eyes swept across the familiar lab equipment, past the human who provided his food and cleaned his litter box, and finally settled on the 8-foot-tall nightmare creature that was currently taking up space in what was clearly his territory. The Shadow Maw, sensing movement, turned its glowing eyes toward the small creature. Finally, it thought, something that would react appropriately to its presence. Small prey animals always had the proper response to apex predators: fear, flight, or freezing in terror. This was going to be refreshing after the human's bizarre behavior. Mr. Whiskers looked at the Shadow Maw. The Shadow Maw looked at Mr. Whiskers. The universe held its breath. Then Mr. Whiskers did something that would be talked about in xenobiology circles for decades to come. He sat down, wrapped his tail around his paws, and began to groom himself with the kind of deliberate indifference that suggested the galactic terror was about as threatening as a particularly large houseplant. "Oh, that's Mr. Whiskers," Morgan said without looking up from her notes. "He's not supposed to be in here, but he's got separation anxiety, and frankly, he's better company than most of my colleagues. Mr. Whiskers, this is—sorry, What did you say your name was? I am the Shadow Maw, the creature repeated, but its voice had lost some of its thunderous confidence. The small orange thing was completely ignoring it. This had never happened before. Mr. Whiskers finished grooming his paw and looked up at the Shadow Maw with the expression cats reserve for things that are mildly interesting but not quite worth getting up for. It was a look that said, "You exist. I acknowledge this fact, but I am not impressed." The Shadow Maw took a step forward, its claws clicking on the lab floor. Surely this would trigger some kind of response, maybe a hiss, or that arcing back thing that small mammals did when they felt threatened. Mr. Whiskers yawned. He's not much of a conversationalist, Morgan explained, still scribbling notes. But he's an excellent judge of character. If he's not running away screaming, you're probably not as dangerous as you think you are. The Shadow Maw's eyes narrowed. It had conquered worlds. It had made entire species extinct. It had literally been worshipped as a death god by the Xerion Collective. And this orange fluff ball was treating it like furniture. I have slain thousands, the Shadow Maw growled, lowering its head to Mr. Whiskers' level. I have drunk the blood of champions. I have... Mr. Whiskers stood up, stretched with the kind of elaborate casualness that cats use to show they're not intimidated by anything, and then did something that would haunt the Shadow Maw's dreams for years to come. He walked directly toward the 8-foot-tall apex predator, rubbed against its lower leg like it was a particularly satisfying scratching post, and began to purr. The Shadow Maw froze. This was not in any of its behavioral programming. Prey animals didn't snuggle. They certainly didn't make those weird vibrating sounds that seemed to indicate contentment. And they definitely didn't start kneading their claws against its armored hide like it was some kind of oversized cushion. "Oh, he likes you," Morgan said, looking up from her tablet. "That's unusual. He normally hates everyone except me and the guy who delivers the lab supplies. You must have a very calming presence." Calming, the Shadow Maw, destroyer of worlds, had been described as calming by a human, while a small orange creature was using it as a mobile scratching post. Mr. Whiskers, having determined that the large dark thing was acceptable, decided to escalate the situation. He began that peculiar cat behavior known as making biscuits, kneading his paws against the Shadow Maw's leg while purring loud enough to be heard over the lab's ventilation system. The Shadow Maw looked down at the cat, then at Morgan, then back at the cat. Somewhere in the depths of space, it could almost hear the sound of Commander Vextar's career imploding. Does it do this to all large predators?" the Shadow Maw asked, its voice now carrying a note of genuine confusion. "Only the ones he likes," Morgan replied cheerfully. "Congratulations, you've been approved by the most discriminating creature on Earth. That's actually quite an honor." He once hissed at a Nobel Prize winner for 3 hours straight. The Shadow Maw, terror of the galaxy, looked down at Mr. Whiskers, who had now progressed to head-butting its leg with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for catnip, or particularly good tuna. This was not how the test was supposed to go. This was not how anything was supposed to go. But Mr. Whiskers was just getting started. What happened next would be studied by xenobiologists, military strategists, and animal behaviorists for generations. It would also be completely misunderstood by all of them, because none of them were cats. Mr. Whiskers suddenly stopped his affectionate rubbing and sat back on his haunches, fixing the Shadow Maw with what Morgan had learned to recognize as the stare. It was the same look he gave the red dot from her laser pointer, the same look he gave birds outside the window, the same look he gave the automatic vacuum cleaner before he declared war on it. The Shadow Maw, sensing the change in atmosphere, straightened up. Finally, it thought, the small creature was going to show some proper respect for the apex predator hierarchy. Mr. Whiskers' pupils dilated. His tail began to twitch with the kind of rhythm that suggested someone was about to have a very bad day. "Oh no," Morgan said, not looking up from her tablet. "He's gone into hunt mode. You might want to back away slowly. Whatever you do, don't run. That just makes it worse." "I do not retreat from small prey animals," the Shadow Maw declared, drawing itself up to its full height. "I am the terror of a dozen star systems. I do not fear." Mr. Whiskers pounced. Now, to be clear, he didn't pounce on the Shadow Maw. That would have been suicide, and cats, despite popular belief, are not actually suicidal. They're just very, very confident in their abilities. What Mr. Whiskers pounced on was the Shadow Maw's tail, which had been swishing behind it in what the cat clearly interpreted as an invitation to play. The Shadow Maw spun around with a sound like a landslide having an emotional breakdown. "What is it doing? Playing, Morgan said, making notes, or possibly establishing dominance. With cats it's usually both. Mr. Whiskers had latched onto the tip of the Shadow Maw's tail with all four paws and was doing that thing cats do where they kick with their back legs while biting with their front teeth. It was the kind of behavior that would have been adorable if it was directed at a stuffed mouse instead of an appendage belonging to the most feared creature in the galaxy. The Shadow Moth tried to shake the cat off, but Mr. Whiskers had entered what cat experts call berserker mode. He was completely focused, utterly determined, and absolutely convinced that this tail needed to be subdued for the good of the household. "Get it off! Get it off!" the Shadow Maw yelped, spinning in circles like a dog chasing its own tail, except the tail was being chased by something else entirely. "I wouldn't recommend grabbing him," Morgan advised calmly. "He's not declawed, and he's got excellent reflexes. Just wait it out. He'll get bored eventually." But Mr. Whiskers wasn't showing signs of boredom. If anything, he seemed to be enjoying himself. The big dark thing was making interesting noises and moving around in entertaining ways. This was the best toy he'd had in weeks. The Shadow Maw, meanwhile, was having what could only be described as an existential crisis. It had faced down armored battle fleets. It had fought creatures twice its size with acid for blood and a bad attitude. It had once eaten an entire diplomatic delegation just to make a point. But this small orange menace was completely immune to intimidation and seemed to view the galaxy's apex predator as a particularly entertaining plaything. "Why isn't it afraid of me?" the Shadow Maw wailed, still spinning. "Everything is afraid of me. I'm genetically engineered to be the perfect predator. I have redundant organ systems. I can see in 17 different spectrums of light. I can survive in the vacuum of space." "Can you catch a laser pointer, Dot?" Morgan asked, looking up from her tablet with genuine curiosity. The Shadow Maw stopped spinning. Mr. Whiskers, caught off guard by the sudden halt, tumbled off the tail and landed in a perfect cat-like crouch, immediately beginning to groom himself as if nothing had happened. "What is a laser pointer, Dot?" the Shadow Maw asked suspiciously. Morgan reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small red laser pointer. "This is going to be interesting from a scientific perspective," she murmured, clicking it on. The red dot appeared on the floor between the Shadow Maw and Mr. Whiskers. Both creatures immediately focused on it with the kind of intensity usually reserved for life or death situations. Mr. Whiskers' pupils went full black, his body lowered into a hunting crouch, every muscle tensed as he prepared to pounce on the mysterious red prey that had dared to enter his territory. The Shadow Maw's head tilted to one side, its glowing eyes tracking the dot with laser focus. Something deep in its predatory brain was telling it that this small red thing was very important and needed to be caught immediately. Morgan moved the dot slightly to the left. Both predators pounced simultaneously. What followed was a collision that would have been hilarious if it hadn't involved claws, teeth, and several thousand pounds of muscle mass. The Shadow Maw and Mr. Whiskers crashed into each other in a tangle of limbs, fur, and confused growling. The laser dot, meanwhile, had moved to a completely different part of the room, leaving both creatures wondering where their prey had gone. "Fascinating," Morgan noted, scribbling furiously. "The laser dot triggers the same predatory response in both species. I wonder if this is a universal constant, or if it's specific to carbon-based life forms." The Shadow Maw untangled itself from Mr. Whiskers and looked around frantically for the red dot, which was now dancing across the far wall. The cat, meanwhile, had spotted it and was already stalking toward it with the kind of determination that had made his species the most successful predators on Earth. "This is humiliating," the Shadow Maw muttered, but its eyes were still tracking the dot. "I'm supposed to be testing humanity's response to an existential threat, not playing with toys." "Life's full of surprises," Morgan said cheerfully. "Besides, you're learning valuable information about Earth's dominant predator species." The Shadow Maw looked at her, then at Mr. Whiskers, who was now crouched in the corner, tail twitching as he prepared for another pounce. "That small, orange creature is your dominant predator?" "Well, he certainly acts like it," Morgan replied. "He's got the entire household trained to serve his needs. He's claimed the most comfortable sleeping spots, and he's established a clear hierarchy where he's at the top. Plus, he's got that whole, 'I could kill you but I choose not to' attitude that all great predators have." The Shadow Maw considered this information. In the corner, Mr. Whiskers was demonstrating his hunting prowess by attacking the laser dot with a combination of stealth, speed, and complete disregard for his own safety. Maybe, the Shadow Maw thought, it was time to reconsider its understanding of what made something truly dangerous. The laser pointer had been put away after what Morgan would later describe in her research notes as the incident with the filing cabinet. Neither the Shadow Maw nor Mr. Whiskers wanted to talk about it, though both still occasionally glanced toward the dented metal with what looked suspiciously like embarrassment. Now, an hour later, something remarkable was happening. Mr. Whiskers had apparently decided that the Shadow Maw had passed whatever mysterious test cats use to determine acceptability. This decision had been reached through a complex evaluation process involving sniffing, a brief attempt at grooming one of the creature's claws, and a thorough inspection of the Shadow Maw's reaction to having his personal space invaded. The Shadow Maw, for its part, had given up trying to maintain its terrifying reputation and was now sitting on the lab floor in what could only be described as a state of resigned confusion. This was made significantly more confusing by the fact that Mr. Whiskers had decided the creature's lap was the perfect size for a nap. "This is not how apex predators are supposed to behave," the Shadow Maw muttered, looking down at the purring orange mass that had somehow taken up residence between its legs. "I should be inspiring terror, not providing— what is this called?" "Lap service," Morgan supplied helpfully, not looking up from her computer where she was frantically typing up her observations. "And you're doing great. Look how relaxed he is. His stress levels are probably at an all-time low." The Shadow Maw's stress levels, however, were doing something entirely different. Every time the cat shifted position or made that weird rumbling sound, the creature's heart rate spiked. Not because it was afraid of the cat, exactly, but because it was becoming increasingly clear that it was completely out of its depth. "He's so small," the Shadow Maw said, almost to itself. "How is something so small, so confident?" "Oh, that's just cats," Morgan replied, finally looking up from her screen. "They're basically tiny lions who've convinced themselves they're still in charge of the pride. Mr. Whiskers there probably thinks he's doing you a favor by letting you exist in his lab." Meanwhile, in the depths of space, the Galactic Council's monitoring station was having what could politely be called a complete meltdown. "The biometric readings don't make sense," squeaked Junior Technician Pip, a small blue creature who looked like a stressed-out Smurf. "The Shadow Maw's cortisol levels are off the charts, but its adrenaline is normal. Its heart rate keeps spiking, but there's no indication of combat or flight response." Commander Vexstar leaned over the monitoring equipment, his compound eyes reflecting the chaotic readouts. "What about the humans? Are they mounting a defense, calling for backup, evacuating the area?" "Sir, the human appears to be taking notes. Her stress levels are actually lower than baseline. She's consumed 3 cups of a stimulant beverage and appears to be having what our translation matrix identifies as a really good night at work." Ambassador Quillnox rippled with agitation. "This makes no sense. The Shadow Maw is the ultimate predator. It should have eliminated the human threat within minutes of materialization. What's taking so long?" "Sir," Pip said, his voice climbing to a pitch that made nearby equipment vibrate, "I think you need to see this." The main screen flickered to life, showing the interior of the lab. There was Dr. Morgan Wells, calmly typing at her computer. There was the Shadow Maw, sitting on the floor like a particularly large and dangerous pet. And there, curled up in the space between the creature's legs, was Mr. Whiskers, fast asleep and purring loud enough to be picked up by the monitoring equipment. The command center fell silent except for the sound of Pip's nervous grooming and the gentle hum of electronics trying to process readings that shouldn't exist. "Is the Shadow Maw being used as furniture?" Vexstar asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It appears so, sir. The small orange creature seems to have claimed the Shadow Maw as territory. Our behavioral analysis subroutines keep crashing when they try to process this interaction." Quillnox floated closer to the screen, his jellyfish-like form pulsing with what might have been disbelief. "What is that orange thing? Some kind of Earth weapon? A biological defense system?" "According to our database, it's classified as a domestic companion animal," Pip reported, his voice now reaching frequencies that only dolphins could properly appreciate. "Average weight 12 pounds. Primary activities include sleeping, eating, and something called knocking stuff off tables. Threat level assessed as minimal to houseplants." "A 12-pound pet," Vexstar said slowly, "has somehow neutralized our ultimate weapon." "Sir, it gets worse. The Shadow Maw just tried to move, and the orange creature made a sound that our translation matrix can't identify. The Shadow Maw immediately stopped moving and appears to be apologizing." On the screen, the Shadow Maw was indeed making soft, placating noises toward Mr. Whiskers, who had opened one eye to express his displeasure at being disturbed. The eye closed again, the purring resumed, and the galaxy's most feared predator went back to serving as a cat bed. "They've weaponized cuteness," Quillinox whispered. The humans have somehow turned adorable creatures into a psychological warfare system. No wonder the Shadow Maw is compromised. Should we recall the mission, sir? Pip asked. Vexstar stared at the screen, watching as the Shadow Maw carefully adjusted its position to better accommodate its small orange passenger. No, we need to see how this ends, for science. But mostly because none of them had any idea what they were supposed to do next. Back in the lab, Morgan was putting the finishing touches on what would become the most cited paper in xenobiological history. You know, she said to the Shadow Maw, you're actually quite good at this. Have you ever considered a career change? I bet you'd be great at animal therapy. The Shadow Maw looked down at the sleeping cat, then at the human who was treating this entire situation like a mildly interesting research opportunity. I think, it said slowly, I may need to make a phone call. The emergency communication that reached the Galactic Council 20 minutes later would go down in history as the shortest mission failure report ever filed. It consisted of exactly 7 words. Mission failed. Requesting immediate extraction. Send help. Commander Vexstar's response was considerably longer and contained several phrases that don't translate well into human languages, mostly involving references to the Shadow Maw's parentage and suggestions about what it could do with its mission parameters. You're telling me, Vexstar said, his voice climbing to frequencies that made nearby equipment start smoking, that you've been defeated by a household pet? The Shadow Maw's response came through the communication array with what sounded suspiciously like a purr in the background. Commander, I need you to understand something. This creature isn't just a pet. It's a tactical genius. It analyzed my behavior patterns, identified my weaknesses, and then systematically dismantled my psychological defenses using a combination of indifference, physical contact, and something called making biscuits that I still don't fully understand. It's 12 pounds. Size is irrelevant. This organism has somehow convinced me that providing it with a warm sleeping surface is not only acceptable but actually an honor. I've been reprogrammed, sir, by a creature that spends 16 hours a day sleeping. In the background, they could hear Dr. Morgan Wells saying something about fascinating interspecies bonding and revolutionary implications for xenopsychology. Ambassador Quillnox rippled forward. Shadow Maw, what's your assessment of the human threat level? There was a long pause. When the Shadow Maw spoke again, its voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much and understood too little. Ambassador, the humans aren't the threat. They're just humans. But they've managed to domesticate something that can defeat our ultimate weapon using nothing but attitude and selective affection. They've created a creature that can establish dominance without violence, command loyalty without fear, and inspire protective instincts in beings specifically designed to be predators. Are you saying the cats are the real threat? I'm saying the humans managed to turn apex predators into willing servants who provide food, shelter, and entertainment in exchange for occasional acknowledgement of their existence. Do you understand what that means? The command center fell silent. In the background, they could hear Mr. Whiskers beginning to purr again, a sound that was somehow both soothing and terrifying when you realized what it represented. They've mastered the art of making other species happy to serve them, the Shadow Maw continued, not through fear or domination, but through something far more insidious. They've made it voluntary. Vexstar's antennae drooped as the implications hit him. Extraction authorized. Return immediately. Sir, there's one more thing. The human female wants to know if I'd be interested in participating in what she calls ongoing research. She's offered to provide food, shelter, and regular interaction with the orange creature in exchange for behavioral observations. Absolutely not. Return to base immediately. Sir, she's also offered to show me something called catnip and mentioned that there are other cats who might be interested in meeting me. The communication cut off abruptly, leaving the Galactic Council staring at a blank screen and the distinct possibility that they'd just lost their ultimate weapon to what amounted to an alien petting zoo. 3 hours later, the emergency session of the Galactic Council reached a unanimous decision. The official record would later state that humanity had demonstrated sufficient defensive capabilities to warrant immediate recognition as a Class A galactic civilization, with full membership privileges and a seat on the High Council. The unofficial record, sealed for 1,000 years, simply read, "They've weaponized cuteness. We surrender." Back in the lab, Dr. Morgan Wells was having the best night of her career. Not only had she made first contact with an alien species, but she'd also managed to complete her research on interspecies behavioral adaptation and secure funding for the next 5 years. Mr. Whiskers, meanwhile, had acquired a new favorite napping spot and a research partner who was very good at staying still for extended periods. The Shadow Maw, now officially classified as a visiting research fellow, was beginning to understand why the humans had been so successful as a species. They didn't conquer through force or intimidation. They simply made other species want to stick around. "You know," Morgan said, scratching behind Mr. Whisker's ears while he purred contentedly on his new favorite alien, "I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship." The Shadow Maw looked down at the small orange tyrant who had somehow convinced it that providing lap service was a privilege rather than a humiliation. "I think," it said slowly, "I'm starting to understand why you humans took over your entire planet." "We didn't take over anything," Morgan replied, grinning. "We just made everyone else comfortable enough to stick around. That's the real human superpower, not violence or technology or even stubbornness. We're just really, really good at making friends." And somewhere in the depths of space, the Galactic Council was learning that the most dangerous thing in the universe wasn't a weapon or a predator or even a particularly clever species. It was a house cat who had decided you were acceptable.